So we will have a lovely time. I'll introduce my fellow conspirators one by one. I'm delighted to be here since this is the opening night, essentially, of the NBA playoffs. I can say that this is my home court. This is the place where I really most like to give talks. So I'm going to start with a kind of quiz show format, and the quiz show is. And the quiz show format is going to be titled, Which is Checker? Okay, ready? And we'll have more of this later, but this is example one. Example two. Well, you'd think that it would really be the first one, which is the checker, because it has the name in the title. It's called Overture on Czech Themes, and it uses a Czech folk song, so it's got to be Czech, except that the composer is a Russian. And the second one, it's got to be Russian because it's a famous Russian folk song. Tchaikovsky used it, but the arranger is Dvorak. So the question of what's Czech and what gets to be Czech, what makes something Czech, it might strike us as silly or prosaic or hopefully not too annoying. But we're in a space called the Bohemian National Hall with a Czech center, a Czech consulate, and various Czech and Czechoslovak organizations. And so we might periodically ask, as a little bit of a tonic, what Czech actually might mean in such cases. And indeed, since the name of the hall, the Bohemian National Hall, implies it has something to do with nation, then we might ask whether the word Czech has to do with a nation, or are Czechs an ethnic group? Does it have to do with ethnicity, whatever we think that is? As noted, when in the 19th century people said, I have Czech or Hungarian or Norwegian blood in my veins, it wasn't a metaphor. They actually thought that there was a specific blood which belonged to nationality. And for a while it seemed we'd gotten away from that, but now everybody's doing 23andMe and walking around and saying, I'm 77% Czech, I'm 27% Lithuanian. So that changes things. But the question of what is Czech and how do we think of the word and how should we think of it falls under the heading of what always has been for me one of the loveliest formulations about anything, which is, we know what it is when you do not ask us, but when you ask us, we cannot say. And so I assembled a wonderful group to try to tease out some of the issues around the question of Czech and specifically Czech music. And we'll begin tonight with this crew that we've assembled. The first will be Erika Honisch. Professor Honisch is one of my favorite scholars. I've known her for quite some time. I've heard many of her presentations. She's an associate professor of musicology and theory and the graduate program director at Stony Brook University. She's also an affiliate in the history department. She is somebody of wide-ranging interests, both geographically, musically, psychologically. She's interested in many different kinds of things. She's written wonderful things about maps and early music, music's materialities, and music and ritual. She has won many prizes. She's an excellent teacher. I know this because she very frequently posts things that she's doing with her classes online. And every time I see it, I have a twinge of sort of insecurity that I might not be working hard enough because her courses are brilliantly planned out. So I knew that she would be able to give us some insight, particularly when you look at the early fringes, because clearly the idea of Czech music seems to resonate with the national awakening in the 19th century. But what about these earlier periods? How should we think about such things? Are we lumpers or splitters or both? And take it away. Of course. Since it's Passover, we're playing Passover.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Daha for hosting us. It's just a real pleasure to be here and to be able to think about this question, which is such a good question. You ask the best questions, Mike. So I'm going to focus my remarks on composers active in the Czech lands in the years around 1600, towards the end of what's often called the Renaissance, just on the cusp of the Baroque. And for those who don't spend much time in the recesses of the polyphonic past, a few comments about the style of what we're going to hear will help us get attuned to its workings. Around this time, around 1600, composed music, which is to say notated music, was almost exclusively vocal. The bulk of it sets Latin texts, not all of it, but the bulk of it sets Latin texts on religious subjects. This is music for groups of literate singers to sing, singers like this dapper group in Hradec Králové. We can imagine their voices intertwining to create a dense and seamless fabric, weaving in and out, sometimes lining up to clearly and vigorously project a joyful text. Sometimes it's hard to cut off. We've caught these men singing De Cantabat Populus. The people sang in praise, and with the singers, David played his lyre in the house of the Lord. And we really have caught them singing. We can tell by the right hand of the man just to the left of the music you see. We can tell by the right hand that he is beating the tactus, often described as taking about the duration of a heartbeat. His left hand points to the music, which is by someone who signed his name Georgios Rychnovinus, so Latin, so learned, but whose friends probably called him Jiří Rychnovský, so Czech, so learned. With Rychnovský still in our ears, let us approach the question, who gets to be called Czech, via a very quick tour of a few musical snippets from this early moment in Czech music history. I'm tempted to call it prehistory. The first snippet is by someone everyone would agree was Czech, Krzysztof Harant, a composer who spoke Czech, wrote a travelogue in Czech, had a certifiably Czech name, and to really seal the deal, rebelled against the Habsburgs. Surely it doesn't get more Czech than that, for which misdeed he was executed in Prague's Old Town Square in 1621. We'll hear about a minute of music that Harant wrote while in Jerusalem. We learn from his travelogue that he was inspired to write it when he heard monks in Jerusalem singing from their balcony overlooking the old city. He was so moved by the experience that there in the shadows of Mount Zion, he wrote his own setting of the text he'd heard the monks singing, "They that trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion." And we'll listen to the lines, "Mountains surround Jerusalem as the Lord surrounds his people." We'll hear the voices move apart and converge, creating a space to encircle. A brief passage of leaps gives the impression of a rugged terrain of peaks and valleys. The second excerpt comes from an anonymous composition that would have sounded Czech to the singers who sang it, or at least it would have sounded right to the Czech singers who sang it. This is how we sing it. This is the way we sing this tune here, or maybe just there is no other way to sing this tune. The music is written in praise of Jan Hus, a beloved Czech martyr. We see him burning on the left in the page that immediately precedes the music in this source. The composer used a technique that was quite old-fashioned by this time in the late 16th century. He took a Gregorian chant used for martyrs, Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, let us all rejoice in the Lord, and he stuck it in a lower voice, and that's what you see here, one of these lower voices. He used it as a musical foundation, adding 4 newly composed voice parts to it, but it's that foundation that makes it Czech. Gaudeamus omnes was a ubiquitous and useful plain chant. It was sung for the Virgin and all sorts of saints all over Europe. And I'm just going to hop over to the piano for a second, very briefly. It's very short. So everywhere in Europe, they sang it like this. But in the Czech Lands, it went like this. The offending note, or I put an arrow through there. You can see it. And it is offending to some. A few years ago, a choir I worked with sang the Czech version of the melody at the University of Notre Dame. And a question came from the audience afterwards, was it you who brought that corrupted chant here? To which I, of course, responded, it's not corrupt, it's Czech. Let's listen to the opening of the polyphonic setting now. We can see it here. The chant is buried in there, almost impossible to pick out, but in every turn of phrase, it's the chant that determines what the other voices must do. So short, let's listen to it one more time just so you can not hear the chant, which is really buried in there, but is, as I say, absolutely determinant of what the musical fabric. Go back to the beginning. Lovely. The singers found it hard to sing. It's a bit unusual in all the best ways. Okay, my last excerpt comes from a composition by a butcher in Pilsen who was, depending on which music historian you read, Silesian, Bohemian, Polish, German, Czech. a representative of the Dutch school, Central European, Eastern European, Slavic, Jewish, Catholic, a man or a woman. This universal human was born in Silesia and appears in musical sources as Simon Bar Yona, as you see him here in the right-hand column, Simon Bar Yona, or as Simon Bar Yona Madelka. The Bar Yona does hint at Jewish roots, but by the time we find him in the Czech Lands, he was Catholic and living in Pilsen. He had fled there in the 1570s because Bohemia was more hospitable to Catholics. Silesia was at that time predominantly Lutheran, and there he lived out his days. So let's listen to a wondrous passage from one of his 7 penitential psalms. These are deeply emotional, reflective texts. In the preface, he likens his own settings to 7 dancers treading in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And this is his take on the words, "For in you I place my hope, O Lord. You will hear me, O Lord, my God." Historians have put Madelka in just about every box you can imagine, with things reaching absurdist heights by the early 20th century when we find him as a great German woman composer, Madelka Bar Yona. If you didn't hear any of the musical excerpts I played as being especially Czech, certainly not in the way of the 2 excerpts with which Mike began, you're not alone. I don't really hear them as especially Czech either. This style doesn't lend itself well to parsing along national or nationalist lines, at least from the perspective of music analysis. The music of Michna or Biber or Mahler or Haas or Klein is much more obviously rooted in the region. So what do we get from calling this music Czech? To use Mike's framing, what's the cost benefit? Well, that depends on who you are. If you're a listener, let's say a Czech listener, perhaps some of what you get is a sense of pride in a lineage or a tradition. Perhaps in this international style, you hear evidence not just of contact with Europe as a whole, but of the Czech lands being embedded in Europe as its heart. If you're not Czech, perhaps what you get is a category of otherness, an exotic obscurity, a renaissance on the edges, your discovery. I listen to Czech early music. Have you heard of Rychnovsky? For marketers, it has all the makings of a good brand. Aren't you more likely to buy music that's Czech rather than music that's merely old or vaguely early? And in these algorithmic days, aren't you all likely to find something Czech or it to find you? If you listen to this, you might like this. But if you're a music historian, you might find yourself in the peculiar position of locating the music of Renaissance composers active in the Czech lands in the monuments of Austrian music, the monuments of Slovenian music, the monuments of Old South Bohemian music. I haven't talked about the composers who were employed at the Habsburg court in Prague, always foreigners, usually from Belgium or Holland, celebrated across Europe. These composers left the Low Countries as boys, spending their whole lives away, sometimes yearning for home, as did Philippe de Monte, the most prolific and famous of them all. There is no music history that makes them out to be Czech, but why not? In the spirit of a round table, I have more questions than answers. Can a composer be also Czech, or do they have to be exclusively Czech? In the case of someone like Madelka, whose music has only very recently become available in a modern edition, it seems that if you belong to too many people, you don't belong to anyone at all. It's the both ands, the all of the aboves, the refugees, the expats, the third culture kids who get edged out when you have sets with hard edges. As a music historian, surely there's a great advantage for the category of Czechness to be capacious, to think of all the manifold ways that set is fuzzy, geographically, temporally, linguistically. I want to think of it as a category that will never be settled. It enables discussion. Without the category of Czechness, there'd be nothing to debate. And increasingly, I find myself willingly slipping between Czech and Bohemian, from Czechy to Bohemia, thinking of all the ways in the period in which I study, Bohemia was a place of refuge, an idea, and an ideal, a place where a maybe Jewish butcher named Madelka could make a musical home. What would it mean for Czechness as a historiographic category to be that open-ended, that all-embracing today?